Welcome everybody to Buddhism in a Nutshell. This is our third of our fourth classes. The first class we had was like pretty much an introduction to Buddhism, just trying to explain the way that Buddhists think and operate in the world. And also we gave a short biography of Buddha and what was important in his life, and how Buddhism spread all around the world. The second class we had was devoted to Buddha's main teachings, which were the Four Noble Truths. And we pretty much spent the whole time in the Four Noble Truths, because once you understand the Four Noble Truths, you really pretty much have all of the important aspects of Buddhism. Now for this, our third of our four classes is going to be, we're going to transition now and start talking about the actual path to enlightenment, the actual steps, and we're going to break it down in a very detailed way, starting at the very beginning and going all the way until full enlightenment, all the way along the path. And to me, it's always been remarkable that in Buddhism that this is spelled out. Because when I first heard about Buddhism and I heard about enlightenment, I always thought that enlightenment was some really thing way out there. And it is a very difficult achievement, but it's remarkable that the path is actually, the full path is actually described in great detail, even though it may be very difficult to achieve the very final, the very highest realizations. It takes a lot of work. The way we're going to go through this is, instead of me just making up things, we're actually going to follow an ancient text that was written in the 1400s by Lama Tsongkhapa. And in the Tibetan lineage, which is the lineage of our center, this sort of description is called Lam Rim, or stages of the path. It was first written down by Atisha, who came in sort of the second wave of Indian Buddhist masters who came to Tibet. So this goes back to about 1000 AD. And when Atisha came, he saw that the first wave of teachings in Tibet had sort of broken down and degenerated, and that people sort of needed help. And he came upon this way of writing down this Lam Rim text as a guide to the people to help them go through the, follow the path and have an easier way to follow the path. So when he was there, he wrote a very short text called Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. And this was the first Lam Rim text. Lama Tsongkhapa, who started our lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, so as I explained in the first class, there's 4 Tibetan lineages, of which our center belongs to the Gelugpa tradition, which is formally what the Dalai Lama also belongs to, and which is actually the very largest tradition in Tibetan Buddhism by far. When Lama Tsongkhapa came along, he thought that this Lamrim Chenmo was so important that he actually wrote multiple Lamrim Chenmos. So he wrote at least 3 important ones, what you might call a short version, and then a middling version, and then a very long version, very extensive version called the Lamrim Chenmo, which in English translations comes out to be 3 volumes, and which Geshe Sopa very kindly gave a commentary on that I think runs to 5 volumes. So it's a very extensive, detailed description of everything you need to do to follow the Buddhist path. So it's actually a quite beautiful and very helpful thing. So the version that we're going to go, the text that we're going to go through is the very shortest version of the Lam Rim that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote. And it's called the Foundation of All Good Qualities. And the text of it is included in the materials section on our website where you click on to join this course. In the material sections, there's various handouts. And one of the handouts, in fact, handout number 6, includes this text, the Foundation of All Good Qualities. And this Foundation of All Good Qualities is really written in the form of a prayer, actually. And it's a prayer that actually is requesting to achieve all of the important spiritual realizations that one needs to achieve enlightenment. So it's actually in the form of requests. So it's quite beautiful. Sometimes it's talked about in the sense of in the context of saying that there are 3 principal aspects of the path. So, I mean, of course, the path to Buddhism is very, if you go into all of the details, is extremely long and detailed. And Buddhists go to great trouble to actually make it very detailed, because the goal in Buddhism is always to help people. And to help people, we need to give them all the details, because sometimes people struggle to really understand what it means. So we give stories and even further elaborations. So that's how you can get to the 5 volumes that Geshe Sopa published, which I think is one of the clearest books ever. Those 5 volumes is one of the clearest texts on Buddhism that I've ever read. It's just amazing. Geshe Sopa was a Larampa Geshe, the highest Geshe, the highest intellectual degree that you can get in Gelugpa Tibetan Buddhism. And he was renowned as a famous scholar. He became a professor at the University of Wisconsin in the United States. He was just an amazing scholar, and his book is so clear. So if you ever get a chance to read any of those, by all means, try to do so. They're absolutely wonderful. And they actually form a large part of my understanding of Buddhism. Although I've had many teachings, many different teachings. I've been around Buddhism for a long time, but these texts by Geshe Sopa are amazing. So anyway, there are these 3 principal aspects of the path. So we have this full path to enlightenment, but Lama Tsongkhapa very kindly sort of broke it down into 3 major parts. And those 3 major parts are called Renunciation, Bodhichitta, and the Wisdom of Emptiness. And so these are sort of huge milestones along this larger path to full enlightenment. So what is the first one? The first one, I'm going to talk about each of these in greater detail, but just briefly. Renunciation really means the decision to leave samsara. So as I discussed in the first 2 classes, samsara is this ordinary life that we live, this ordinary world. And as you look at this ordinary world, you see all the suffering in it. And as I talked about in Buddha's biography, the goal of Buddhism is for us to learn how to be happy and how to avoid suffering. And what Buddha said is, he said, as long as you're in this conventional world of samsara, you can't escape suffering, that the nature of samsara is suffering. And if you look at the history of mankind, I think you see this. I mean, there's been golden periods, but there's always been suffering. And if there's no other suffering, there's a suffering of ageness, sickness, and death, if nothing else. So anyway, we're going to talk more about this. So renunciation is this idea that we need to get out of samsara, and that's called liberation from samsara. And when you're liberated from samsara, what we say is that you achieve the state of nirvana, which is complete blessed happiness, far happier than anything you could imagine. The second milestone is called Bodhichitta, or the mind of awakening. And this is what, as I talked about in the first couple of classes, in the beginning, one had the original Buddhism as Buddha taught it, but starting around just before the birth of Christ, they developed these schools of what is now called Mahayana Buddhism. And in Mahayana Buddhism, it's basically the same as the original Buddhism, but it adds an additional emphasis to this notion of helping others, benefiting others. And in fact, that becomes the key motivation. The key motivation is not simply to worry about our own suffering, but to relieve the suffering of all sentient beings, all beings with a mind. And that higher goal is what is the Mahayana goal. So it was implicit in the Buddha's original teachings, but in the Mahayana tradition, it was given huge emphasis until it becomes the whole major thing. And as we'll see, I hope to get to this path toward the end tonight. As we will see, this accelerates all of the wonderful aspects that you learn in the beginning parts, which was what a Buddha originally taught. So it's like an acceleration. It's like Buddhism on steroids, if you like. It's quite amazing. And as I mentioned before, Mahayana Buddhism is now the primary Buddhism, which is the main Buddhism that exists all throughout the world. The only earlier form of Buddhism, which the Mahayana is called Hinayana, but nowadays we tend to call the foundational aspects of Buddhism, are the group of people who call themselves Theravada Buddhism. And this is people centered around Sri Lanka and so forth, who follow the more traditional path that the historical Buddha actually taught. And they actually have a very beautiful, and they actually have kindly collected for us all the original teachings of the Buddha and translated them into English. And so if you want to actually read all of the original teachings of the Buddha, you actually read the Theravadan version. And this was done in a language called Pali, which was called a Prakrit, or a more colloquial or simpler language version of Sanskrit. So the colloquial languages that were spoken in India around the time of Buddha were basically similar to a very simpler form of Sanskrit. Okay. So, and then the final principal aspect of the path, or the final real teaching, is the wisdom of emptiness, which is the truth of reality, what reality really is, how we actually see the world as it really is. And this is a huge teaching that's considered the most complicated thing to understand in Buddhism. And we will mainly talk about that, mainly probably in the last and final class, as long as with a description of Tantra or Vajrayana Buddhism and some other final things. So in this Lam Rim, Atisha and Tsongkhapa following up actually tried to sort of divide it up into sort of what they called actually 3 types of people. But if you like it, it's actually sort of 3 different aspects of the path. And so these paths look like, and these people look like that when you read it, it looks like, well, you start off with the lowest person, then you move to the intermediate, and then the great. So they're actually called scopes also, the small scope, the intermediate scope, and the great scope. And so the way it's written, it looks like, oh, well, I should start at the small scope, accomplish all of those realizations, move on to the intermediate scope, accomplish all of those realizations, and then go to the great scope and accomplish all of those. However, as Buddhism is actually practiced, we actually don't do it that way. We actually practice aspects of all 3 paths simultaneously. And so in many ways, we're working at many different levels simultaneously. And it turns out that that's actually very helpful, because Buddhism is pretty much all interconnected. And so when you're learning advanced practices, it actually is making your lower practices more solid, and you understand them better, and it actually helps you along those. And in the same way, the lower portions of the path serve as a solid foundation for all of the higher realizations. So all of these, and in fact, that was one thing that Lama Tsongkhapa in particular always strongly emphasized, that you can't ever say, oh, I've got this realization, it's done, forget about it, I can now move on to higher realizations and forget all the lower stuff. He said you can never do this. He said that you have to keep all of your realizations fresh and ongoing, and sort of keep all of these things going. And I think the reason for that is because all of these different aspects mutually support each other. And so you actually need all of them. One image I've always had is, I remember years ago, they would have circuses and they had people with sticks, and they'd have little plates that they would be twirling around, and they could keep maybe 4 or 5, 6, 10 plates going all the time, you know, and they would go from one stick to the other and give them a little twirl and keep them all going. And that's how I sort of look at the realizations of Buddhism. We sort of got to keep twirling all of these things and keep refreshing them. And whenever one part of our path starts falling down, occasionally we need to go back and renew that and strengthen it, because all of these things are important. Okay, so that's the sort of the big picture. So yeah, so, oh, I forgot to mention, so I talked about these 3 types of persons. What are they? So the person of the small scope is, well, first of all, before I go there, it's actually helpful to talk about sort of the zero scope. Because I think for most of us, the zero scope is we want to be happy right now in our current life. So we want, you know, to make money, not to suffer, to be happy in this, our very own life. And in Buddhism, sometimes they talk about that and they say, they sort of discount that, saying, well, you know, if you're on that path, then you're no different than an animal, because an animal wants to eat well, have a wonderful home, you know, not be sick, you know, have enough to eat and so forth. And so in Buddhism, they sometimes say, well, if that's your only goal, then you're no different from an animal. I think that's a little bit harsh, because I think, you know, if the goal of Buddhism is to be happy, we need that minimal level of happiness as well. And I think actually the practices of Buddhism help accomplish those goals as well. Particularly as we'll talk about karma, as we talked about it before, if you're creating positive karma, even these other things, wealth, freedom from illness and so forth, will be eventually accomplished if we keep generating positive karma. So, and I don't think that is really such a bad thing. You know, it's okay to want to be happy. I think part of the reason why they don't talk about it is this notion, as we will come up to, of renunciation. That when you realize that none of these things are really satisfactory, that even if you have gobs of money, you're not necessarily happy and they don't bring true satisfaction. And there's nothing in samsara that will bring true satisfaction. You realize why, when we start talking about a spiritual path, we actually raise up to a higher level of awareness or consciousness, if you like. So the real starting point in this spiritual path is what's called the small scope. And in the small scope, what we really focus on is this notion of rebirth. And in particular, we want a higher rebirth. We want a rebirth in our next life, at least at the level of humans, which is the lowest level of the various types of rebirth you can have. And actually, you know, it's okay if you go up to the godlike levels, but actually our real goal if you're practicing a spiritual path, as I mentioned before, is actually the human rebirth. And I talked about that before, and I will come and talk about that again and explain that further. The intermediate scope is actually the scope on the focus is on the liberation from samsara. So the goal is what we call the lowest form of nirvana, liberation from samsara. As we will discuss further, there are higher levels of nirvana. The higher level that we will eventually want is the full nirvana of Buddha, which is higher than liberation from samsara. But on this intermediate scope, the goal is simply to escape from samsara, to achieve liberation from samsara. And when you achieve that, in the terminology of Buddhism, in the Sanskrit, you're called an arhat. In the Pali language, which is what these Theravada, the simpler form of Sanskrit, discuss, you're called an arahant, very similar, because the two languages are very similar. The final and the highest goal, which is the goal that we follow as Mahayana Tibetan Buddhism, involves this notion of developing bodhicitta and achieving full and complete enlightenment. And on the Mahayana path, our goal is not just to achieve full enlightenment, to become, if you like, the equal to the original Buddha, to achieve that level of spiritual qualities, not just because it makes us happy or more blissful, because you actually achieve a lot of bliss from just becoming liberated from samsara, but it's because as a Buddha, you can achieve your goal of best relieving the suffering of all other sentient beings. Because as a full Buddha, you have amazing spiritual powers. And even after you achieve liberation from samsara, you continue to work for the liberation and of all other sentient beings, chiefly through the form of bestowing blessings upon them and providing help wherever you can. And again, as I talked about in some of the earlier classes, you can say, well, if the Buddhas are giving us help, how come we're not all Buddhas? And as the Buddha explained, we are the stumbling block. It is our minds that keep us locked in samsara. It's actually, for most of us, we view samsara as sort of a pleasure garden. We don't want to leave samsara. We ourselves are the people that keep us stuck in samsara because we think it's wonderful. We don't realize its true nature of suffering. And so so what the Buddhas can do is they tend to bestow blessings. And when they bestow blessings, that helps in the minds of many people, the way they describe these blessings is it helps us to activate our positive karma, which helps us develop ourselves in the spiritual path so that we can more quickly escape from samsara ourselves. Okay, so that's the beginning stages. So now we come back to the actual text, this what I call the foundation of all good qualities. And what I'm going to do is this has, I forget, about 10 to 15 verses. And what I will do is I will go through and read verse by verse and then give an explanation, because in so doing, it really carries us all the way through pretty much all of the important things you need to know about Buddhism. That's sort of a great, at a high level. So the whole purpose of this course is to explain the whole of Buddhism in as simplest way as possible, using the simplest language that I can use to make it understandable to people who don't, in particular, who might not know anything about Buddhism. And so we're sort of looking at it from a high level. And of course, all the other courses that we teach at our center and so forth fill in all the details, of which there are many, certainly. Okay, so the first verse that starts out is And in fact, this first verse shows why the text is called the foundation of all good qualities. Because the first verse begins, the foundation of all good qualities is the kind and venerable guru. Correct devotion to him is the root of the path. By clearly seeing this and applying great effort, please bless me to rely upon him with great respect. So as I mentioned before, these root texts are actually a prayer. And you see that in the final line, please bless me to rely upon him with great respect. In Tibetan Buddhism, it's considered to actually these kinds of prayers or requests to the Buddhas are considered to be very important on the spiritual path. And in my mind, one way of looking upon this is that when we keep asking the Buddhas to achieve these spiritual qualities or realizations, what we are doing is we are pointing our mind along the spiritual path. We're actually directing our attention and wishing very strongly to achieve these qualities. So it's so helpful. It's pushing us along exactly the correct direction that we need to move in. Okay. So far, this is the first time I've mentioned guru, perhaps, in this class. And I'm not going to talk about it very much more. So the guru just means, in Sanskrit, it just means spiritual teacher. And in Tibetan, the same word is translated in Tibetan as lama. So lama means the same thing, spiritual teacher. And in Buddhism, it's understood that we need spiritual teachers. That, how are we going to find this path to enlightenment if nobody tells us about it? Who's going to guide us when we go wrong? And it's so easy to go wrong. In our earlier class, I've talked about these afflictions, delusions, these negative states of mind, this sort of self-egotism, which is always sort of pulling us away from the spiritual path. And we slide into so easily. And that's why it's so helpful to have a spiritual teacher to help us along this, to point out where this egotism or this greed or hatred or all these negative states of mind are occurring, and how to help us to work through those and to get past those so we can achieve higher spiritual realizations. And there's in Tibetan Buddhism, there is a large number of teachings on the importance of actually finding a good guru. Because in this world, as we know, there's many charlatans, there's many people who are just after our money or want praise or want to become renowned or famous, who become great teachers. They're often wonderful speakers, people who can give wonderful speeches, they're very persuasive, but often they're just in it for glory or money. And they actually lead us along wrong paths. They actually move us further away from the true spiritual path, from the spiritual path that helps us grow as a spiritual being. And when I talk about spiritual path, it's actually a very broad path. The Buddha recognized that there were many different types of people, and that different types of people need different types of help to advance further along the spiritual path. And in particular, when the Buddha would go and teach to different groups of people, with his mind, he could encompass sort of what the people were like who he was talking to, and he would actually give specific teachings that he felt would most benefit those. And in Buddhist lore, today's speakers try to do the same thing, although we don't have these same, we're not Buddhas, we don't have these spiritual powers where we can, at least most of us don't, where we can go out and actually sense what people need. But we still employ what's called skillful means, which means that we try to be skillful in providing the help that people actually need, as opposed to just having some rigid path and just propelling along there. So even though we have this lam rim, we have the stages of the path, we have this this whole setup of all these spiritual qualities that you need to achieve in practice for each of us and for each of the people, if we're teachers, that we teach. We need to help them in the ways that they need help. And for that reason, the scope of Buddhist teachings is very broad. It can be very practical, almost like self-help things, to very deep meditations and very blissful, amazing states of mind at the highest levels. But in Buddhism, it's always considered important to teach and to help people at the level where they need help. And so that's why we have gurus, because having a real living person is a person who can actually oftentimes sense where we're at and give us more detailed hope. Of course, most of us rely upon books and teachings and so forth, and that's very helpful. And you can get books at various levels, so you can sort of do skillful means yourself. But it's extremely helpful, I think, and it's always been recognized as extremely helpful to have a live teacher, if at all possible. Okay, so that's the first one. So the verse on the guru. The second verse is something that one of the questions we had last week, I think, talked about. And this is the notion of precious human rebirth. So the way the verse reads is it says, understanding that the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once, is greatly meaningful, and is difficult to find again. Please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly, day and night, takes its essence. So the translation is a little bit funny. It talks about a rebirth found only once. What they mean by that is that we are in this current rebirth. So this is our one. It doesn't mean you will only be reborn as a human once. It means that at this present time, we are humans. And in Buddhism, in fact, the Buddha himself taught this, that actually human rebirth is difficult to achieve. Among all the different classes of rebirth, the higher levels of rebirth get progressively harder and harder to achieve, and they acquire more and more merit or positive karma in order to be reborn into these higher states. So it's actually an amazing thing to be reborn as a human. But it's especially important because among all the difference of all these different levels of rebirth, from hell realms to very heavenly realms, all of which are temporary, because as your karma burns up, if you have negative karma, you fall into a negative state, but as you go through that existence, you burn up that negative karma and eventually rise up again. And if you're in a heavenly realm, a godlike realm, you've achieved great, as you are enjoying the bliss of that heavenly realm, you're burning up all your positive karma, and eventually you will sink back down again. So in samsara, one goes, it's like an elevator, one just goes up and down constantly, and you never get anywhere. If you like, samsara is the ultimate rat race. So if you think of a rat or a gerbil or some little animal going around a spinning wheel over and over again, that's the way samsara is. It's endless. When you think about it, it's just exhausting. You never get anywhere. The only time you can get anywhere is if you actually escape the whole system, which is what's called liberation from samsara or nirvana. And that's why it's considered such an important goal to achieve that. And the other problem with samsara is that it's completely uncertain, because who knows what karma we've created in our past lives. And that karma is like a time bomb just sitting there ready to go off at any moment. So for that reason, you are always a little bit unsettled. And as I mentioned before, it's not completely hopeless, because if you are leading a really strong, positive spiritual life now, you tend to ripen all of your positive karma. And in fact, the way that karma ripens, as I've talked before, is not one for one. And even if you have horrible karma in the past, if you are a deep, positive, spiritual person now, that negative karma will ripen in a much ameliorated form. and won't be as strong. So nonetheless, this verse is what you might call a motivational verse. You know, and the final line of it says, day and night, take the essence of this precious human rebirth. So it's an encouragement saying, you've got this wonderful birth. It's perfect. If you're in the heavenly realms, you have so much bliss, you don't feel like spiritual practice. If you're in the lower realms, you're suffering too much and it's too hard. You don't have the resources to do spiritual practice. In this human rebirth, you have everything you need. Take advantage of it. It's such a wonderful opportunity. So it's an encouragement, if you like, to accomplish spiritual practice. Okay, so now we go to the third and fourth verse. And so this is about karma, death, impermanence, and things like that. So obviously this is you know, a very big part of what we traditionally think of as the Buddhist path. I think the emphasis on death is the one thing that might surprise people if they're beginners to Buddhism. But I think there's a simple explanation for that, and we'll go into that. So verse 3 begins, this life is as impermanent as a water bubble. Remember how quickly it decays and death comes. After death, just like a shadow follows the body, the results of black and white karma follow. Finding firm and definite conviction in this, please bless me always to be careful to abandon even the slightest negativities and accomplish all virtuous deeds. So, so there's a number of the terminology, parts of the terminology in these verses are a little bit symbolic. For example, black and white karma is really just a euphemism for negative and positive karma. Negative karma is the karma that brings suffering when it ripens, and positive karma or merit is the white karma, brings happiness and pleasure when it ripens. And okay, so I think that's it. So the beginning part talks about the impermanence of life, and it uses this symbolism of a water bubble, which Buddha himself used when the historical Buddha, when he was teaching. And he's just saying that our life's so fragile. You know, any little tiny thing can kill us off. You know, a little virus, a disease, you can get hit by a car, you can choke on a fish bone. You know, there's just so many thousands of ways to die off. And life is constantly changing. You can't depend on anything. Anything good that you get, you can't hang on to, because life just constantly changes and continually is churning about into new things. And that's the nature of life. And so recognizing that, that's also true for death. So he talks about that death follows us, just like a shadow follows a body. And that's this notion that Buddha always emphasized again. He was saying that one of the sufferings of our human life is death, and it's inescapable. And in fact, the way that he talked about it was even in a more direct way. What he said is, anything that's born has to die. That's just the nature of things. If it's born, it has to die. If it comes into existence, it goes out of existence. That's just the way everything works. And so in that sense, when we talk about liberation from samsara, the other way that we often talk about it is never being, ever again, being reborn in samsara. Because once you're reborn, then you're stuck in samsara until you die. So the goal when you achieve nirvana is once you achieve a state of nirvana, you were never reborn in samsara ever again in any of these various realms of samsara, but you were sort of in a different type of existence called nirvana, which is this existence is probably the closest to what you might think of as Christian heaven, total bliss, eternal bliss all the time. So that is the goal. And but death is a problem because it well, let me come back to that. Let me talk a little bit about karma first, because this whole verses, these two verses are really about this black and white karma. It's really about karma. And in Buddhism, there's actually large teachings on karma. We can spend many, many classes on karma. And in particular, they talk about three different aspects of karma, which are helpful to distinguish. The first is what's called throwing karma. So at the moment of our death, the karma that ripens at that moment is the karma that determines into which realm we will be reborn, into a higher or lower realm, or maybe to continue into the being reborn as a human once again. And it also determines not only the realm in which we're born, but the state in that realm. Because as I said before, as a human, you know that there's a wide variation in your experiences. You can be reborn in horrendous poverty and suffering, maybe some really terrible part of Africa where there's a lot of disease and, and other tribes are raiding and, stealing things. You can be, life on earth can be a living hell, basically, if you're born into a bad existence, with the wrong parents, wrong place, wrong location, and so forth on earth. Or if you're born in a wealthy country like the United States, of wealthy parents, you may have every opportunity, a very luxurious life, and your life on earth can be like a heaven on earth. And so part of this throwing karma determines, first of all, which realm you're going to be born into. And actually, part of the things that we're talking about is the second aspect and third aspect of karma. The second aspect of karma is that there's a similarity in karma. So depending on the type of karma you generate, when it ripens, it will tend to ripen in a similar way, not exactly the same way. So if you kill somebody, in essence, you are harming somebody, the way that form of karma that you generate by doing that will ripen as some harm coming to you. So it may not come in the form of somebody killing you, but it may come in the form of perhaps some terrible illness, for example, or some other, or maybe, some cruelty of other human beings harming you. It will come back in some form of harming to you. And in the same way, if you tend to steal from other people, if you generate that kind of karma in future lives, there will be a tendency for other people to steal from you. If you are very generous and are very generous with your money, helping the poor in spiritual communities, and being very generous with your money and so forth, the Buddha actually said that's how you generate great wealth in future lives, because as you were generous to other people, in future lives, that wealth will come back to you and you will have wealthy existences. So that's the second aspect. So the first aspect is this throwing karma, throwing you into your next realm of existence when you die. The second is this tendency for karma to be similar, to ripen in a similar way as to what you generated. The third form is what they call the environmental effect of karma. And that's what that means is that when we come into any of these various realms, we are actually, like I say, there's a wide variation. It's like in the animal realm, you can have terrible existences where you're hunted down by carnivorous, horrible animals, or you could be like somebody's pet dog or a kitten or somebody like that and lead almost a very luxurious life where you're well taken care of, fed, almost pampered in every part of your life. And that's the environmental aspects of karma. So depending on the kind of positive or negative karma that you generated, not only can you be born in a higher or lower realm of existence, but also your experiences within that realm can be more pleasant or less pleasant. So that's why the Buddha always emphasized the need to practice virtue in our life. And by practicing virtue, I mean, the Buddha gave many examples, which I talked about before. But basically, if you're benefiting people, if you're doing good things for people, that you're generating positive karma, or if you're doing spiritual practice, that's an amazing way to generate huge amounts of positive karma. On the other hand, if you're harming people in some way, either with your body, either physically hitting them or killing them or whatever, or if your speech cutting them down in very cutting ways that make people feel horrible, or with your mind, even your mind having these wishes of wishing to harm people. In fact, Buddha said, as I mentioned before, that most karma is actually intentional. Karma is really the intention that comes, and the actual physical aspects of what you do physically or with your speech actually just complete that karma and sort of bring it to full fruition. But the real karma is actually that intention of wishing to either benefit or harm people. And of course, there's neutral karma, where you don't do either. And the ripening of that neutral karma is probably most of the experiences we have in our life, which are neither necessarily beneficial or bad. Now, this notion of death is considered very important. And again, certainly the Buddha emphasized over and over again that it is one of the sufferings of life. And most people, most humans greatly fear death, although it's not necessary to do that. In Buddhism, we are taught actually how to be able to have a very calm, peaceful, happy death. And in fact, courses are taught on that. Geshe Sherab at our centers at least once taught on that subject. The Dalai Lama and other people, Lama Zopa, have books on how to have a peaceful, calm, happy death. So you don't have to actually dread death. It can be actually a wonderful experience, and it can be part of your spiritual path. But I think for most of us, it's a very frightening thing because we don't understand what's going to happen. And if there's illness, there can be suffering at the end of our life as well. But from the perspective of this verse and the way that Buddha often taught about death, he taught about it as a motivational factor to motivate us to engage in spiritual practice. I mean, earlier I talked about how precious our human rebirth is. So we have this very precious rebirth as a human, which gives us enormous potential for spiritual practice. And essentially the Buddha is saying, don't waste it. And I think for most of us, we're creatures of habit, and we just do whatever we do, and we just keep doing it. We never really think about our lives that much, or we don't plan our lives very much, or think about what our goals are, except very vaguely. Maybe at the beginning we have a career and we have some goal careers, but most of us, we just sort of go day to day, doing the same things that we did on the previous days. And the Buddha said it's so important to engage in spiritual practice. In fact, in one of his sutras, these sutras are the individual teachings that were recorded that the Buddha gave at various times and places. In one of the sutras to a group of people, he talked about spiritual life as like having your hair set on fire, and that is the way you should think about your spiritual practice, which sounds a little bit funny, but the idea of it is quite simple. The Buddha said, if your hair was on fire, you would be frantic. You would be doing everything you can to immediately put it out. And the Buddha said, you should have that same frantic desire to spiritually practice. Because in a sense, your hair is on fire. You are in samsara. You are burning with the suffering of samsara. And you will be continue to be reborn in samsara and continue with all of the sufferings of samsara over and over again. So in a sense, your hair is burning with the suffering of samsara. So you want to immediately quench it with spiritual practice, put it out. And so the Buddha said you should have that same intensity about your spiritual practice as you would if your hair was on fire. So the Buddha thought that that was so important. And with respect to death, part of the focus on death, there are actually 4 different teachings in this meditation on death. The first is that death is certain. So there's no way to escape death. I mean, do we know anybody that's 200 years old? No. Sometimes they can get up maybe to 120, but but we all die and we know that. But here is the second point. The second point is almost more important. The time of death is uncertain. I mean, think of how many people in this last year got the coronavirus and died. Never expected to die during this year, totally out of the blue for them. Who could have thought we'd have this great pandemic that would just spring up out of nowhere, so to speak, and kill so many people off? And it's like that in all of our lives. It's like you can choke on a fish bone or a chicken bone and die. You can, I actually at this point know many people who have cancer. I had a neighbor whose daughter was once driving home for Christmas and was on an icy road, slid off it and killed herself. So car accidents happen all the time. You can be killed just walking across the street. Some drunk can come careening around the corner. There was a famous Buddhist teacher in Santa Fe who was just, the light turned green, he drove across the street and somebody came out of nowhere across the street and hit him at high speed and killed him instantly. So death can come at any moment in any way. And who knows where we will be reborn again? Who knows if we will have the same wonderful chance to engage in spiritual practice that we have right now? So in that sense, it's so important to engage in spiritual practice. And the third point about these death meditations or teachings is that the only thing that can benefit us at the moment of death is Dharma, the Buddhist teachings. So, when you're dying, you can imagine yourself on your deathbed. You may, it's wonderful to have your loved ones around you, but, how much can they do for you? Or maybe you will have a stroke or be incapacitated or unconscious. Maybe you won't even be able to talk or communicate with them. And certainly your money isn't going to do you any good. But the one thing that can give you spiritual help is actually the Dharma teachings. And it can be, if your Dharma comes back to you at the moment of death, you can do prayers, meditations. It can be so, your passing can be so incredibly peaceful and happy. It doesn't have to be difficult. And finally, the fourth point, which is sort of the main point of this thing, is practice now, because we don't know when death is going to happen. It can happen at any point. So it's really important to take advantage of this precious human rebirth that we have at this very moment. Okay, so now we're going to come up upon the actual renunciation verse, the actual point of this first part of the spiritual path, which is renunciation. And then after that, we're going to segue into Bodhichitta, the Mahayana Path. which is a vast practice all by itself. So we've actually talked a lot about samsara and renunciation already in these first two classes and even tonight. And I mentioned last time, okay, so let me start off as before by reading the verse. So the verse 5 is, seeking samsaric pleasures is the door to all suffering. They are uncertain and cannot be relied upon. Recognizing these shortcomings, again, the prayer, please bless me to generate the strong wish for the bliss of liberation. So this is the actual. So the wish for the bliss of liberation is the actual renunciation. So the renunciation is really the wish to leave samsara. And like in all Buddhism, it's based on, I mean, all Buddhism is based on understanding the reality of the world in which we live, and seeing it clearly. And that's the one thing that Buddha emphasized over and over again. And there's a type of meditation called mindfulness meditation, which really especially focuses on that. It's sometimes called insight meditation, vipassana, other terms like that, where it really tries to focus on what's really going on in our lives right now and seeing that very clearly. And you can say, well, why don't we see it? I'm alive, I'm walking around. And the reason we don't see it is the reason that I talked about in the earlier classes, that we filter everything in our lives through our ego, through our sense of what's good or bad for me. If we think that something is good for us, we tend to exaggerate its goodness. And if we think that something is bad for us, we tend to exaggerate its negativities. And for that reasons, we don't actually tend to see the way things really are, whether they are actually good for us. And in fact, that happens all the time. We misinterpret life. Events happen in our life and we think they're bad. So actually, sometimes later in our life, we look back on that, we realize that the thing we thought was bad was actually good, and vice versa. Sometimes things that we think are good, later on we look, they might bring us brief pleasure in the moment, but they may actually be terrible for the long term of our life. So we're always misinterpreting life. And the goal in Buddhism is to actually see the world the way it really is. And what Buddha said is that there are two aspects of the real world that are so important to understand. And I've talked about both of this. The first one is impermanence, that you cannot depend on anything. Everything always changes. So even if something wonderful happens to you, a wonderful meal or some wonderful, amazing things, or maybe you accumulate a great amount of wealth, you can't hang on to that forever. It will eventually dissipate. You have a great meal and then an hour, short time later, the meal's over and you're full and, it's just a memory, but the memory is never as great as the original thing. You have a brand new car, but it doesn't stay a new car forever. It eventually becomes an old car. We have the amazing wonder of youth when we're so healthy and have all this energy, but then we grow old. It's like that for everything. And moreover, there's no dependability. The world can change at a moment. The clear example is the 1929 stock market crash, when you had these people who were living extremely luxurious, wealthy lives, who suddenly had no money. And they couldn't stand the thought of that. They were throwing themselves out of windows in New York City and killing themselves, committing suicide. And it's like that. Our lives can change, or we can be having this wonderful life, and then suddenly we develop some terrible illness, leukemia, cancer, or maybe the virus will wipe us out. COVID will wipe us out at the next moment. But it's always like that. So life is always uncertain, it's completely undependable. And there's a lot of just natural suffering, sufferings of ill health, of the struggle to make money, to create a living. We're always, if we have children, we're always worried about our children, what's going to happen to them. Are they living a happy life? Are they doing well? We're always worried about our wealth, so on. So samsara, and in fact, what the Buddha said, he said that even if you have things that are very precious, even those things are a cause of suffering because you worry about them. I think the classic examples are children. You know, for us that have children, they are our most precious possession. They are the most amazing, wonderful thing. And for some of us, the same way. If we have grandchildren, it's the same way. But because they are so precious, we worry about them. I had a mother who recently died this past year. She was 99, about 3 weeks short of 100. She'd lived a very happy life, but she mentioned that she always worried about her children her whole life. Even when she was 99, she was always worrying about what was happening to them. Were they doing well? Were there any problems or obstacles in their lives? And it's like that. So even our most precious things, and if you have a lot of money or a lot of possessions, you're worried about them getting stolen or losing them, or fires or wars or other things that can carry them off. So samsara is completely uncertain. So this doesn't mean, and again, when I talked about suffering, suffering has this greater sense of dukkha, meaning being unsatisfactory. So that's a deeper. So there is manifest suffering, but a lot of it is suffering. And it's also the same sort of thing that any sort of pleasure in samsara is not completely satisfactory. It's not perfect. There's always this notion that it can disappear at any moment, and it's so short-lived, and you can't hang on to it. So it's always dissatisfactory. And actually, in life, the only thing that is dependable, that gives true satisfaction, is spiritual practice. And to understand this, of course, you have to actually do spiritual practice and experience it yourself. But you know, there are certain, especially deep meditations, that are extraordinarily blissful, but they also, in a way, feel good. They feel satisfactory in a way that nothing in samsara feels satisfactory. And the other problem with all of samsara is that even the good things are always, in a sense, inducing us toward negative activity. And the example I gave last class was this beautiful metaphor of the Buddha saying, you know, imagine spreading honey on a very sharp edge of a knife that's ultra sharp. He says, can you lick the honey off without cutting your tongue on the sharp edge of the knife or razor? And that's always the difficulty, is that our craving for pleasure, for positive things, and our desire to avoid negative things always tends to lead us into negative activity. And that negative activity tends to create negative karma, which will then ripen in some future suffering. Okay. So that's the notion of liberation from samsara. And so this is, so now we've achieved this sort of first milestone. So this milestone, which is the, this is actually the second milestone. This renunciation is actually this wish to achieve liberation from samsara, is the milestone of actually the person of middle scope. The earlier version, achieving just a good rebirth, means developing, was in the earlier verses, on achieving positive karma, so that we're sure that we develop enough good karma and avoid enough negative karma to be reborn in a higher realm. So now in this next stage, we're going to talk about the Mahayana Path, the person of a great scope, which is this notion of bodhicitta, and this goal of achieving great enlightenment for the benefit of all living beings. So at this point, I will take a 5-minute break to allow us to recharge our batteries a little bit. And then I will come back in 5 minutes and we'll continue on with the Mahayana Path. Okay, so now we're going to begin the final part of tonight's class. It's going to be all on bodhicitta, this Mahayana path. And this bodhicitta teaching is really an amazing teaching. And so anyway, you'll see. So again, this starts off with verses 7 and 8 of the foundational path. And we're going to start off just with the first of those. So there's 2 verses in bodhicitta. The first one is verse 7. And in verse 7, it says, "Just as I have fallen into the sea of samsara, so have all mother migratory beings." Okay, just as I have fallen into the sea of samsara, so have all mother migratory beings, meaning fallen into the sea of samsara. So please bless me to see this. Please bless me to see this, to train in supreme bodhicitta, and to bear the responsibility of freeing migratory beings. So again, we have some various language coming in here. We've talked about samsara, but here we talk about samsara, sort of the metaphor of the sea of samsara, sort of falling into the sea and being overwhelmed by this vast sea of samsara and trying to figure out how to escape from it. We have this notion of migratory beings, and this notion of migratory beings is the sense that all of us migrate from life to life in different levels of samsara, either higher or lower, but we're always migrating. You know, we always live a life, we die, migrate to the next life, live a life, die, migrate to the next life. And we're always stuck in the sea of samsara, constantly moving around, but never escaping. And then but it's called mother migratory beings. And I'm going to explain that, this notion of mothers. There's this notion that everybody has been our mother in some previous life. And I'll explain that. That has to do with how we achieve. It's an imagery that we use for achieving, developing bodhicitta. So let me come back and talk about that in that place. And then, of course, bodhicitta itself. I have to explain what bodhicitta is. And then we talk about bearing the responsibility of freeing migratory beings. So that also is tied up in this notion of bodhicitta. So what is bodhicitta? And why is it so important? In fact, it becomes the consuming focus of all of Mahayana Buddhism. Although in that all-consuming focus on bodhicitta, of course, it's important to realize that to achieve the goals of this bodhicitta, we need all the lower stages of the path, all these what are called either the Hinayana path, but what the Dalai Lama calls the foundational path, the beginning stages, all these teachings on renunciation, karma, and so forth. We need to achieve this final full goal of bodhicitta. As I said earlier, everything is important. And I think, as I've explained before, I mean, I keep talking about these things, these goals of liberation from samsara, full enlightenment. And I think in the West, we tend to get too caught up in this. We tend to think, oh, if I'm not achieving renunciation tomorrow or bodhicitta or full enlightenment next week, you know, everything's wasted, nothing's any good. And it's not like that. All of these realizations develop gradually. As I mentioned in the earlier class, the Buddha taught this wonderful sutra of this image of walking in on a sandy shore into the ocean deeper and deeper. And that's the way the Buddhism is. We develop all of these qualities gradually. And I think what's really important is the day-to-day aspect, that as we develop and go deeper and develop renunciation or bodhicitta or ways of achieving more positive karma, reducing our delusions or this klesha, delusions, afflictions, all of that, we make our life better moment by moment. And not only does that affect us moment by moment, but we're interconnected with all the other living beings. And as we make ourselves better moment by moment, we make the whole world better by moment. We affect all of the people around us. There's a famous Christmas movie about that, about a character who's going to commit suicide because he thinks that he's lost a large amount of money. And then all of the people show all of the wonderful things. An angel comes down from heaven, supposedly, and they show all the wonderful things, different ways that he's helped so many people, and how all these people appreciate them, and they end up helping them in the end. And it's like that. I mean, all of us affect so many other people in ways that we have no idea. And all of this spiritual practice that we do not only makes our own lives happier and happier and removes our anxieties and problems or disturbances or worries about our problems moment by moment, but it also does affect everyone around us. So spiritual practice is really important. So you shouldn't think of it as just this big goal. I've got to become enlightened or liberated from samsara. The journey along the path is absolutely wonderful and very, very satisfying. And that's how we work at Buddhism. So we have these grand goals, liberation, enlightenment, but actually we work at small goals, little by little, and chip away at these. And it's important to enjoy these and not be, if you take care of improving your life moment by moment, you don't have to worry about liberation or enlightenment. Those will come all on their own. So even though we talk about these grand goals, please don't get too hung up on them. Okay, so what is bodhicitta? So bodhicitta is the core of Mahayana Buddhists. And when you develop bodhicitta, that's what changes you into a Mahayana Buddhist, in a sense. And it's defined very simply. So it's designed as the wish to attain great enlightenment. But along with that wish to attain great enlightenment, and this is equally as important, is that wish comes for the purpose, for the sake of all other sentient beings. So again, I could say all other human beings, but since I've talked about all these other realms of samsara, all these other realms that we're born into were called a sentient being, meaning we have a mind, basically. And so the sentient being just means, so it's sort of human beings plus, wherever we end up in any of these other realms temporarily. So this notion of bodhicitta is completely altruistic. It's the opposite of egotism. It's placing other people's interests before our own, thinking of other people first instead of ourselves. It's extremely, it generates extreme amounts of positive merit. It's the most powerful practice you can do in terms of generating positive merit. The only thing that comes close to it is these practices of loving kindness that I talked about last week. What are the benefits of bodhicitta? There are enormous benefits of bodhicitta, both in this life and in future lives. And the reason for it is that we generate we can, if we get to very high levels of this practice, we can generate almost infinite merit. So how does that work? So it's actually very logical. So it's this notion of You know, if I see some hungry person, if I see one hungry person on the street and I give them some food, I've generated some positive merit, some positive karma. I've been helping one person. In principle, if there are two very hungry people in the street and I feed both of them, I've generated twice as much merit. And if there's 10 times as much, and so forth, you know, you sort of get the idea. So now consider what happens if I'm actually helping all sentient beings. Well, all sentient beings is almost an infinity of sentient beings. So if my goal, and again, I said that karma is generated by our intention, if our intention is to help not 1, 2, 10, 100, not just our close friends, but everyone without exception, then in principle, we have the ability to generate that multiplier, almost an infinite amount of positive karma. And that's why bodhicitta is so, so powerful. Lama Yeshe, one of the early teachers of the FPMT, he unfortunately died around 84, 85. He used to say that when you, well, he used to quote Tsongkhapa, who I mentioned was the person who started the Gelugpa tradition, who was this amazing teacher. Tsongkhapa used to say that when you have bodhicitta, all the good things in life are magnetically attracted to you and pour down upon you like rain. And why is that? Well, you know, it's like I say, you know, everything in Buddhism is cause and effect. And if you're generating all this amazing positive karma, it's like it's going to come back to you. It's going to ripen in this and future lifetimes. It's going to be amazing, the amount of help that it can provide to you. The other thing about this benefit of bodhicitta is that it has this focus on others. So one of the terms that we talk a lot about in Buddhism is self-cherishing. Self-cherishing means thinking about yourself. It's sort of this form of egotism. You know, it's like, I want the biggest piece of cake. I want the most money. I want the biggest house. I want all the wonderful things. I don't want anything bad to happen to me. When we're doing it, we're caring. We're just thinking about we're cherishing ourselves. And when we do that, that sort of self-cherishing or egotism is exactly what causes all of the negative actions, all of these motivations. Well, if I want money, maybe I'll steal to get it. Maybe I'll engage in all sorts of misconduct to acquire more money or power or sex or whatever it is that we want. And that's sort of, this egotism is sort of the source of all of our suffering. And even in a simple conventional way, it's the source of our suffering. You know, it's like if we're at a horse race and we're wondering if our horse is going to win, it creates all this anxiety. Is it going to win? Is it not? Is it going to be close? And if it doesn't win, then we feel terrible. Or again, if we lose a lot of money, we feel terrible. Why do we feel terrible? Because it's our money. You know, if it was somebody else's money, it might be bad luck, but we wouldn't feel so terrible. It's like when things happen to us, that's when we really suffer. So when we think about, oh, it's us that this bad thing has happened to, is what generates our suffering. So this egotism is really the source of all of our suffering. And so if you can develop this mind of cherishing others rather than ourselves, it actually just all by itself reduces a huge amount of our suffering. Because then, we don't have this focus on ourselves so much. And if something bad happens to us, it doesn't matter so much because we're not focusing on that. We're focusing on others. So there's huge benefits from developing this focus on others. The other thing that Buddha that is talked about in this Mahayana Path is actually a very interesting idea when you think about it. It's not something that I think we would normally think about, but there's two aspects to it. One is we become a precious being. We become a precious being for other people. I mean, imagine if you know somebody who only cares about helping other people. And if that other person is helping us, you know, when somebody helps us, that other person that's helping us is a precious being for us. And if there's somebody that's helping all of these other people, then that person is a precious being for all of these other people. And again, there's this multiplier effect. So when you start developing this notion of bodhicitta, you start to become a precious person in the world. The other notion of it is that this is how Buddhas are born. And Buddhas are the most powerful, precious beings of all. And through developing this bodhicitta, you are creating this path for yourself to become an even more powerful being, a being that can even help even more people. So you are starting yourself on this path to become this amazingly powerful, spiritual, precious person. So it's like sometimes you say that you're born into the lineage of the Buddhas. So you're on the path to Buddhahood yourself. And again, the other thing that is on a day-to-day level is extremely blissful. Whenever, I've talked about in previous classes about how when you develop loving kindness, how it just makes you glow inside. It brings you deep satisfaction and happiness. Well, this bodhicitta is like this same effect on steroids. It is so blissful. It is so amazing. And ultimately, again, it's not something that falls out of the sky and hits you. It's like everything in Buddhism. To develop bodhicitta, you have to work at it. But once you develop it and bring it to high levels of attainment, it just sort of rolls on its own. It's so blissful that it's almost self-sustaining. It's like you can't stop yourself. It's almost like a drug because it's so wonderful, this feeling of bodhicitta. And it enables you to do amazingly, even difficult things seem very easy. Okay, so another aspect of this that's important is I've talked about how Buddhism is always gradual. And bodhicitta is the same way. There are different levels of bodhicitta. So there's lower levels to really what you might call full bodhicitta. Full bodhicitta is actually very difficult. It's a very high spiritual goal. And so we have to work up to it gradually, like everything else that we do in Buddhism. And in the beginning, you start off with something that is called aspiring bodhicitta. And sometimes they talk about it as artificial bodhicitta. So it's almost like you're pretending to have bodhicitta, even though you don't have real bodhicitta. But it's still helpful. It's so helpful. We talk in many ways about how imagination is so powerful in Buddhism and how it can benefit this in so many ways. And it's the same way with bodhicitta, this notion of artificial bodhicitta, pretending to have bodhicitta, even though you don't, can be so helpful because it means that you're trying to accomplish it. You're doing the best you can and you're working at it. And so this notion of aspiring, even the wish to attain bodhicitta, generates such huge amounts of positive karma. It's amazing. So so you start by just developing this wish. And when you start developing this wish, you start generating all this positive karma. And then because you are generating this positive karma, eventually that karma is going to ripen and you're going to eventually accomplish the real bodhicitta. So you start very simply with just the wish, but that all by itself is just such an enormous step forward. And then the real bodhicitta is a bodhicitta that they call spontaneous bodhicitta. And you actually have to have high meditational states to accomplish this, shamatha and so forth. And so the real bodhicitta requires, more stuff, of course, because it's such a powerful realization. But again, like I say, you don't have to worry about it. Just plug away and work at developing it. And if you work at developing it, you will always eventually get there. But the real bodhicitta is sometimes called spontaneous bodhicitta because it is there day and night. You never stop thinking about bodhicitta, this wish to help others by yourself attaining full enlightenment as the best way to help others. This wish is there day and night, and it's just spontaneous. It's there constantly. And so when you achieve this real bodhicitta, since it's spontaneously there day and night you are generating huge amounts, almost infinite amounts of positive karma. And that's the reason why this notion of bodhicitta can accomplish such a huge goal, such as full enlightenment, the same enlightenment that the historical Buddha had, is that if you're going to achieve such an enormously amazing high goal, the only way to accomplish that, again, through this notion of cause and effect, is to become an almost infinite being. You have to have almost infinite merit. And bodhicitta is the only mechanism where you can acquire such enormous amounts of merit that you can actually accomplish such an amazing, nearly infinite goal. Okay. And then finally, we should talk about a bodhisattva. So we talked about bodhicitta. So a bodhisattva is a person who has a bodhicitta motivation. And here we're talking, again, there's different levels. You can talk about sort of an aspiring bodhisattva, which is what hopefully most of us are. But the real bodhisattva is a person that has this real spontaneous bodhicitta day and night. And as I said before, Buddhas are born from bodhisattvas. And so what is the path of the bodhisattva? The path of the bodhisattva is, well, let's start with the very lowest level. So at the very lowest level, you begin the path by practicing the foundational Buddhism, which is what we've talked about, the Hinayana path, the traditional path that Buddha taught, the historical Buddha taught. So it's all about virtuous actions, which means, creating benefit, not harming, attaining merit, overcoming these afflictive or delusional obstructions, these negative states of mind, gradually dampening them down, applying antidotes slowly, and gradually making ourselves better and better people. And then, of course, at a stage along the path, you will eventually achieve liberation from samsara. However, in the Mahayana path, unlike the other paths, so in the original path that Buddha taught, when you achieve liberation from samsara, you achieve nirvana and you actually leave samsara. So you leave the samsaric life and you sort of disappear from the world that we live in. On the Mahayana path, even though you've achieved nirvana, the small nirvana of an arhat, you can remain in samsara. You can continue to be reborn in samsara. And the only difference between this and the original notion is that you are no longer being reborn in samsara because of your own craving for existence, your own negative states of mind, which are forcing you to be reborn in samsara. But in this case, for a bodhisattva, it's a free choice. You could not be reborn in samsara, but you willingly choose to be reborn in samsara. So it's sort of a completely different, whole different ballgame. And of course, at that point, you don't experience any samsaric suffering anymore, but you are still on the same path. So the reason why you have to do this is because, as we talked about, even at the time of Buddha, at the historical Buddha, people realized that there was a difference between the spiritual accomplishments of the historical Buddha And these other people around Buddha, many people with whom, many hundreds, maybe even thousands of people were becoming arhats under the influence of Buddha's teachings. And there was a huge difference between these arhats and Buddha himself. And the reason why, as I explained in the earlier class, is that even though you've removed all of the gross obstructions, all of the gross negativities of your mind, and purified them to become liberated from samsara to achieve this small nirvana, nonetheless, there are some slight imperfections in your mind, which traditionally are called obstructions to omniscience, that you need to overcome to achieve this higher goal of becoming a full Buddha. And so that's the life that you develop along the Mahayana Path, is you continue to purify your mind to achieve full Buddhahood. So you continue with these notions of bodhicitta, working for others in samsaric existence. Although, because you are an arhat, you have amazing spiritual powers at this point. So you progress quite rapidly. And then when you've purified all of these obstructions to omniscience, then you achieve full Buddhahood, or what you might call great nirvana or large nirvana, the final, the ultimate nirvana. And in the Mahayana Path, it is taught that all arhats will eventually achieve, at some point, even those who disappear from samsara, who were never on the Mahayana Path, eventually Buddhas will come to them in nirvana and give them the final teachings, and then they will continue on the path and purify their mind, and they also will become fully enlightened beings. And so it's said in the Mahayana tradition that every single sentient being will ultimately achieve full enlightenment. However, it might be billions of eons before any of us achieve that. So our goal is to do it faster. Okay, so the other thing that I should say is that once you achieve, again, getting away from this path thing, and these nirvanas and so forth. So if you're following this path, you practice the lower path, the foundational path, then you come to this point where you develop bodhicitta. Once you are working on bodhicitta, the main practice of the bodhisattvas are what are known as the 6 perfections. And these 6 perfections are things like generosity, morality, patience, joyous effort, concentration, and wisdom. So these are specific practices where you develop all of these ways of helping people. So we will come back and talk about those ways. Okay, so that's sort of the bigger path. So the next stage is, how do you develop bodhicitta? And because again, as I said before, bodhicitta is not going to spontaneously happen. It's going to happen only if you create the causes and conditions for bodhicitta to happen. So you have to work at it. And like everything in Buddhism, there are specific things that you can do to develop this. And the Buddha taught these. And in principle, there's sort of 2 main paths to bodhicitta that have been taught traditionally. And these actually have names. One is called Sevenfold Cause and Effect, and the other one is called Equalizing and Exchanging Self with Others. So the first one is sort of the gentle, Sevenfold Cause and Effect is sort of the gentle method, where you very gradually, step by step, work up to bodhicitta. The second one, this Equalizing and Exchanging Self for Others, is sort of for more advanced people. So people who maybe have practiced bodhicitta in previous lives, who are, deeply spiritual beings, they can sort of jump ahead of the game and more quickly develop bodhicitta following the second path. But they both sort of have analogous ideas. It's just that one requires sort of faster development. You have to sort of move ahead more quickly at a higher level. So the first one is this one of sevenfold cause and effect. So again, this is a step-by-step process of developing your mind. And each step is wonderful, and each step is enormously beneficial. So even if you got stuck on the second or third step, it would be a wonderful, hugely beneficial for you. The first step is called developing equanimity. So if our goal is the wish to benefit all other people by achieving our own full enlightenment, because it's only a fully enlightened Buddha who can most beneficially help all, who has the spiritual power to really help so many people. You know, first of all, you have to want to help other people. So how are you going to want to help other people? Well, the first thing is not to hate other people. So the first stage is just developing what's known as equanimity, feeling the same about all other people. So, and again, this is also involved in the second path. The reason there's a very good reason to feel the same about all people, because all of us want to be happy. All of us want to avoid suffering. There's no reason why I'm more intrinsically better than you, or you are intrinsically more better than me. We're all the same. We're all sentient beings. So there's no real reason for any of us to be different. And so what we try to do is we gradually work on this notion of treating everybody the same, so that we love everyone equally the same. And when we see some other person suffering, we say, oh, well, you know, that could be me. You know, I don't want to suffer, just the same. And I see this other person suffering, I recognize the sameness, you know, the same way that I don't want to suffer. There's no reason why they should want to suffer. So we want to help them naturally. And in the same way, you know, if they're happy, we say, that's great. I want to be happy too. And it's wonderful that they're happy. And so in a way, we start off by, you know, first looking at the people around us whom we love, and then gradually we learn to sort of treat all other people the same way as our dear ones, so that we're all on the same level. So that's sort of the first step that we work on, is developing this feeling equally about the same, not having enemies, not feeling that some people are closer to us than others, but sort of realizing that we're all the same, we're all sort of universally human, and developing sort of an affectionate feeling for all of them. But that's even going a step forward, further, is developing these sort of affectionate feelings. So that has to be developed also. There has to be a reason for us to feel that way. And that's where we go into this notion of living beings as our mothers. In Buddhist teachings, he says that Buddha said he could not see the beginnings of any of our lives in samsara, that we've been endlessly cycling through samsara. So every time that we have been reborn in samsara, we've had a mother. And what is asked is, where are all these mothers? All of these mothers are all of the beings, all the other sentient beings around us. And so if you think that we've had infinite numbers of rebirth, then everyone has been our mother at some point or another, maybe multiple times. And if you start thinking about it in that sense, the other way that's important to think about it is that, you know, we always, especially if we've had a good mother, in some of our previous lives, sometimes people in this present life have difficulties with their mothers, but people who have good mothers love their mothers, and they always love them. And even after their mothers die, they still have this loving feeling for their mothers. And what difference is it if your mother died a year ago? If your mother's alive now, your mother died a year ago or 20 years ago, we still have this love for them. It doesn't depend on how long it's been. And if you start thinking that way, what if our mother lived 1 billion years ago? Why should we stop feeling love and affection for her just because it was so long ago? So in that sense, we develop this feeling of love for all of our previous mothers without exception, and no longer how long ago they were being our mother. And so having that sense, and what Buddha said, that even if this thought is difficult for you, even if it's, for most people, it seems very outrageous and strange. But what the teachers always say is that even if it's difficult for you, it's beneficial to think this way. Because if you start thinking this way, it helps you to develop affection for all other sentient beings. So if you think, this other person that's walking down the street toward me, at one point was my loving mother, I should still continue to feel affection for this person. It helps you develop this affection for this person. So if you like this sense that all other sentient beings have been our mothers, is in a sense, it's sort of a trick. It's actually true because we all have had infinite lives and all these other mothers are out there. But in a sense, even if it's just sort of a tricky way of thinking, it's still beneficial because the goal is to develop uniform affection for all sentient beings without exception. And to get closer to this feeling, first of all, the next step, the third step, is remembering the kindness of mothers. So if you've had a wonderful mother, you remember her kindness. And when you remember her kindness, that's what generates affection. People who've been kind to us, we feel affectionate toward. And that is and then we're getting closer to there. So there's actually a step in between that. So this is really, really little baby steps. So first, we think of all other sentient beings as our mother. We remember the kindness of our mother. And because we have had that kindness, we develop the wish to repay that kindness. I mean, all of us who have had loving mothers take care of our mothers. We always wish to repay the kindness that they have shown to us. And through that wish to repay the kindness, that leads us to develop affectionate love, the sort of love that a person has for a good mother. And if we think of all other sentient beings as having been our mother, then all of these are actually meditations that we do where we think this way, and we take it in very deeply through meditation. That slowly over time helps us to develop the same affectionate love for everyone, all sentient beings, every single human being on the earth, even people who previously we might have thought were our enemies. And from that affectionate love, then the next stage is if we have affectionate love for someone, we don't want to see them suffer. And that's what compassion is. Compassion is the wish for others not to suffer. So if we have compassion for it, it's the wish to free those other people from suffering. And so once we develop this affectionate love for all sentient beings, then it's very easy to slide into the next step of developing universal compassion for all sentient beings without exception. It's sort of the notion of that, if we have this deep affectionate love for our child, and our child is playing in a lake and falls in the water and starts to drown, we would rush in immediately and do everything we could to save our child because we have compassion. We don't wish to see our child suffer or be harmed in any way. And it's the same sort of thing that happens. Once we develop this deep affection for all other sentient beings, we can't bear to see them suffer. And so we develop this enormous compassion, this wish to free them from suffering. And this great compassion is this amazing driving force that leads us to develop what's called the, I guess it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're getting close to the superior intention. Superior intention is this decision. We're going to do something about it. So the superior intention is like the mother that sees her child drowning in the lake, who has this intention. She's going to save her child no matter what it takes. You know, sometimes mothers can do amazing things. They can lift, 2,000-pound cars to free their kid who's underneath them, a tire of one or something. You know, it's like, when we have this enormous, great compassion for people, we just can't stand to see them suffering. And because we can't stand to see them suffering, there's no choice. We have to do something to relieve their suffering. And that leads us to the very final stage, which is developing bodhicitta. Because as ordinary beings, we're so powerless. There's so little we can do. We just don't have much power in this world. We're just individual people. However, great spiritual beings have enormous power to do that, especially because they've generated such enormous positive karma. Probably the best way you can see that is that if you see someone like the Dalai Lama, you see how many millions of people the Dalai Lama helps and is beneficial for. And it's because he's this great spiritual being and he has great spiritual power. And if you mentally extrapolate that, if the Dalai Lama has this great spiritual power, imagine how much more spiritual power a Buddha had and how much more help that a real Buddha could benefit, not just one or two, but almost infinite numbers of people. So from that superior intention, especially once we develop this great intention or great compassion, great always means everyone without exception. Once we develop these feelings where we just have to do something, then at that point, we develop this amazing bodhicitta. We can't help it. We're driven to accomplish bodhicitta. So at this point, so that's how we use the sevenfold cause and effect to develop bodhicitta. And again, you can see it's this gradually step-by-step thing, but it's so powerful. And each step along the path is so beneficial and actually brings great joy and happiness moment by moment into your life. There's all of these types of affections or compassions are such powerful, positive spiritual states of mind. And they also develop these enormous amounts of positive karma. So they are just absolutely extraordinary. Okay, so it's 9 o'clock now. And so I always stop on time because everybody has limited amount of time. So I've come very close now to finishing the main teaching on bodhicitta. And so next week, I'm going to talk about the second path called equalizing and exchanging self with others. And what you will see is that this path of equalizing and exchanging self with others runs very much parallel to the first path. It's sort of a way of almost sort of deepening them, this path. And in fact, many people who are working in bodhicitta actually work on both of these two methods together, because each of these methods sort of helps and supports the other method. And together they work extremely well at developing these minds of bodhicitta, which are, again, develop these enormous amounts of positive karma and so forth. Okay, so that's the, so I'm going to stop here. I think this is a natural thing. There's also some other aspects of this Mahayana Path, bodhicitta. There's one that's really important called Lojong or Tonglen, or sometimes training the mind, bringing difficulties onto the spiritual path, which personally in my life I found enormously difficult, enormously beneficial, especially when you are at moments of great difficulty, when you are really struggling in life. This Lojong or Tonglen is truly extraordinary. And then I'm also going to talk about the wisdom of emptiness, which is the deepest teaching of the Buddha. And in this deepest teaching of the Buddha, it actually, in many ways, It's said to be very difficult to understand, but nonetheless, it's easy to get at least a rough idea of what it's about. And it also, as I said, all aspects of the Buddhist path support each other. And if you really get this notion of emptiness, it really helps and supports all the other earlier teachings. And they all make more sense. And you can progress faster and more quicker on them. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Tantra, or the Vajrayana path, which again is not a separate path. It is also it is a Mahayana teaching, but it's, if you like, an accelerated path to enlightenment. So in the Tantric path, it's said that even in a short time, even in a few years or even a few months, for people that are deeply spiritually developed, they can achieve full enlightenment even within this lifetime by practicing this Tantric or Vajrayana path. And then I will sort of conclude and tie everything together and answer any questions. So at this point, let me just ask if there's any questions or any comments.